A bear cub hugged his leg and refused to let go. What happened next will melt. The forest was unusually quiet that morning. Thomas, a middle-aged farmer who lived on the edge of the valley, had set out early to check on his fence line. He liked these walks. The morning air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. Normally, he would hear birds chirping and squirrels chattering in the trees, but that day, there was only silence, the kind of silence that makes a man feel he's being watched. As he crossed a narrow clearing, he suddenly felt something tug at his leg. He froze. At first, he thought it was a fallen branch or perhaps a stray dog. But when he looked down, his breath caught in his throat. Clinging tightly to his boot was a tiny bear cub. Its fur was a soft, dark brown, matted with dirt and twigs, and its small body trembled violently. The cub's round eyes, wide with fear and desperation, looked up at him as if pleading for comfort. Thomas had never seen anything like it. He stood completely still, his mind racing. Cubs were never far from their mothers, and an angry mother bear was the last thing he wanted to face alone in the woods. His eyes darted around, scanning the trees, expecting at any moment to see a massive shadow emerge. But the forest remained empty, eerily still. Meanwhile, the cub refused to let go. Its tiny claws dug gently into his pants, and when Thomas tried to step back, the cub only clung harder, pressing its face against his leg as though he were the only safe thing in the world. In that moment, Thomas realized this was no ordinary encounter. Something had happened, and this cub needed him. Thomas's heart pounded as he stood in the clearing, the cub refusing to release his leg. He crouched slowly, careful not to startle the animal. Up close, the cub looked even more pitiful, its ribs faintly visible under its fur, its nose dry, and its small whimpers breaking the silence of the forest. "This little one is starving," Thomas muttered under his breath. The cub's desperation was unlike anything Thomas had ever seen. Instead of growling or trying to scratch, it clung tighter, almost as if it understood that he might be its only chance at survival. Its soft, pleading eyes seemed to beg, "Don't leave me." Thomas glanced around again. Still no sign of the mother. Bears were fiercely protective, and it was nearly unthinkable for a cub to be alone like this. A chilling thought struck him. Had the mother been injured? Or worse, hunted? The farmer felt a lump in his throat. He had grown up respecting wildlife, knowing nature could be both cruel and beautiful. But the sight of the helpless cub tore at something deeper inside him. He tried to take a step, but the cub stumbled after him, nearly tripping over its own tiny paws to keep up. Every move Thomas made, the cub mirrored, refusing to let more than a few inches come between them. Finally, Thomas sighed and knelt again. Slowly, cautiously, he extended his hand. The cub sniffed his fingers, then pressed its wet nose into his palm with surprising trust. It was a silent plea for comfort, and Thomas couldn't ignore it. What started as a simple morning walk was quickly turning into a life-changing decision. He knew he couldn't just walk away. Thomas stood frozen in thought, the cub still clinging to him. Every instinct told him this wasn't a simple encounter, this was a turning point. He had always lived quietly, tending his small farm at the forest's edge, avoiding unnecessary entanglements. But now, with this frail creature pressed against him, walking away felt impossible. The cub whimpered softly, the sound so fragile it cut straight through him. "You're just a baby," Thomas whispered. "And you've got no one left, do you?" He straightened up and glanced back toward the woods one last time, hoping against hope to see the shadow of a mother bear emerging. The trees swayed gently, but no movement came. Only silence answered. His mind wrestled with the risks. Bringing a wild animal home could cause trouble, with neighbors, with wildlife officials, even with the cub itself once it grew larger. Yet his heart argued louder than logic. If he left it here, the cub would surely die. The little bear pawed weakly at his boot, almost as if echoing his inner conflict. Thomas's chest tightened. He remembered a winter years ago, when he had nearly lost his dog Daisy to the cold. He had fought to keep her alive, and she had remained his most loyal companion until her last day. The memory lit a spark in him. Finally, he made his choice. Thomas knelt, scooped the cub gently into his arms, and whispered, "All right then, you're coming with me." The cub nestled against his chest with a tiny sigh of relief, as if it understood that it had finally found safety. Thomas knew his life was about to change forever. But at that moment, he felt only peace, and a deep, unshakable responsibility. Back at the farm, Thomas placed the cub gently on an old wool blanket near the fireplace. The cub sniffed curiously, its round eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. It let out a soft squeak, then pressed itself closer to the warmth of the fire. Thomas watched carefully, unsure of what came next. He set down a shallow bowl of water and a small plate with a bit of bread and goat's milk. At first, the cub ignored it, too frightened and exhausted. But after a while, its tiny nose twitched, and it waddled toward the bowl. Thomas smiled as the cub lapped clumsily at the milk, spilling most of it on the floor. "Messy eater, aren't you?" he chuckled. The cub looked up briefly, milk dripping from its muzzle, then went back to drinking. That night, Thomas barely slept. He kept checking on the cub, worried it might be too weak to make it through. Each soft whimper tugged at his heart, but by dawn, the little bear was breathing steadily, curled into the blanket like a child. Over the next few days, something remarkable began to happen. The cub started following Thomas everywhere. Whether he was feeding the chickens, chopping wood, or fixing the fence, the cub would toddle after him on wobbly legs, determined not to let him out of sight. At first, Thomas thought it was just hunger or fear. But soon he realized it was more. The cub trusted him, truly and deeply. Each evening, when Thomas sat by the fire, the cub would crawl into his lap and bury its nose against his shirt, drifting off to sleep. And every time, Thomas would gently stroke its fur, wondering how a bond so powerful could form in such a short time. What began as an act of mercy was turning into something far greater. Days turned into weeks, and the little cub grew stronger. Its fur thickened into a soft brown coat, and its once timid eyes now shone with curiosity. It had gone from a frightened orphan to a playful companion who filled Thomas's once silent farm with life. Every morning, Thomas would wake to find the cub waiting by the door, eager to follow him into the fields. When he carried buckets of water, the cub tried to paw at them, splashing half the contents on the ground. When Thomas stacked hay, the cub would clumsily tumble into the pile, rolling over with an innocent squeak as though begging him to laugh. At first, Thomas resisted the feeling growing inside him. "You're a wild creature," he reminded himself. "Not a pet. Not mine to keep." But no matter how many times he told himself that, the cub's gentle persistence melted his resolve. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Thomas sat on the porch with the cub at his side. The air was still, the sky painted in soft oranges and purples. Absent-mindedly, Thomas reached down and scratched the cub behind the ears. To his surprise, it leaned against him, letting out a low, contented rumble. That sound struck Thomas deeper than he expected. It wasn't just trust, it was affection. Genuine, unguarded affection. Word of the strange friendship spread among the nearby townsfolk. Some came to see for themselves, shaking their heads in disbelief. "That bear should have run off into the woods by now," they said. "Why hasn't it?" But Thomas knew the answer. The cub didn't stay because it couldn't leave, it stayed because it didn't want to. In the silence of that moment, Thomas realized something he hadn't dared admit before. He needed the cub just as much as the cub needed him. What had started as a chance encounter in the forest was blossoming into a bond that defied nature itself. Seasons changed, and the little cub grew into a strong young bear. Its once clumsy paws were now powerful, its body towering over Thomas's shoulders. Yet, despite its size and strength, it never lost the gentle bond it shared with him. But nature had its own way of testing that bond. One autumn morning, Thomas was walking through the woods gathering firewood when a group of hunters appeared on the trail. They noticed the bear beside him and immediately raised their rifles. "Stand back," one of them shouted. "That beast will turn on you any second." Thomas quickly stepped in front of the bear, his hands raised in desperation. "No. He's not a threat. He's not like that." The cub, now nearly a full-grown bear, stood tall behind him. Instead of roaring or showing aggression, it pressed its head gently against Thomas's back, as though saying, "I'm with you." The hunters hesitated, confused. This was no ordinary bear. There was no wild fury in its eyes, only loyalty and calm. After a tense silence, they lowered their weapons and slowly backed away. When they were gone, Thomas turned to the bear, his heart racing. He wrapped his arms around its thick neck, whispering, "You saved me, again." It was in that moment Thomas realized the truth. Their bond had passed its greatest test. Not only had he given the cub a second chance at life, but the bear had chosen to stand by him, when instinct, when nature itself, should have pulled it away. Years later, Thomas would often tell neighbors, "That bear taught me more about loyalty than most people ever could." And though the world saw a wild animal and a man sharing an impossible friendship, Thomas knew the deeper truth. The cub who once clung to his leg had never really let go, not in body, not in spirit, not in heart. Theirs was a bond unbroken, carved into the memory of everyone who witnessed it.